Hey guys, today we're going to talk about selecting fletching. Fletching, the feathers on an arrow that make it go straight. Now there are predominantly two types of fletching. You will either have, no, not them, those. You'll have either rubber or plastic veins, such as these, which are made out of a semi sort of rigid plastic rubber mix. They have their benefits, or you will have feathers. Again, they have their benefits, but they've all got the pros and cons, but natural feathers, basically, cut from the flight feather of a particular bird, usually goose. There are other types, such as shrink veins and things like that, but I'm not going to talk about them because most people aren't going to bother. They're too expensive, they're too much of a hassle to use, and the vast majority of people are going to go for plastic or natural feathers. So, lots of variation, lots of availability, all available commercially. Now you can buy them separately, as I did with these plastic ones. They could buy a dozen of one colour and 2 dozen of another colour to make up a dozen arrows, or you can buy them as a pack. That's a dozen fletchings. So if you bought 2 packets of them, well, 2 packets of the red and a packet of the yellow, that gives you enough fletchings to do a dozen arrows. It all depends what sort of thing you're going to do. Now, there are a few things to take into consideration. Which ones are those? Those are purple ones, I think. There are a few things to take into consideration. It all depends on the style of shooting you're going to do as to what kind of fletching you could really do with. Now, at the end of the day, if you are just an informal back garden shooter, just enjoying yourself in the back garden, it doesn't matter what fletchings you use. The only time any of this stuff is going to come into importance is when you are making and fletching your own arrows. Now at that point you may want to take a few things into consideration, and the first one being the purpose to which your arrows are going to be put. For instance, if you're a flight shooter, now for those of you who don't know what flight shooting is, that's basically shooting the longest possible distance in a fixed number of arrows and a fixed number of shots. So basically what you would do, it's a bit like roving, but it's basically what you would do is you would fire a shot, and say you've decided, say it's a 3-shot competition. You fire a shot to gain as much distance as you possibly can with that arrow. You then go to where the arrow landed, and then you fire another shot to gain as much distance, and then you go to where that arrow landed and you fire another shot, and then you add those distances you shot together, and the person with the highest amalgamated shot distance wins the competition. That's flight shooting. So what you want there is the lightest possible arrows travelling at the highest possible speed in order to get the maximum distance. Now the only thing about fletchings is fletchings reduce speed. They can increase stability, but at the same time reduce speed. So if somebody who's shooting flight you would go for the smallest possible fletchings you could get away with to impart stability while keeping the velocity as high as possible. For instance, if you're shooting flight, a 50 foot per second difference can mean 20 or 30 yards in distance, and that can mean the difference between winning a competition and coming second or third or fourth. So that's flight shooting. So in flight shooting, you want the smallest possible fletching you can possibly get away with. If you're doing close-in hunting out to 30-40 yards, you need something that's going to give you really, really good stability, because your aim is all important, but you're not so concerned about speed. I mean, speed is a factor, but what is more important is energy and accuracy. So you would go for a slightly bigger or slightly longer fletch. And it can be quite complicated. However, most people aren't going to bother unless they build their own. Now, there's a few things to remember to take into account. Again, depends what you want to do. If you want to build the most accurate arrows you possibly can, you're going to have to, I don't know if I've got any to show you, you're going to have to get the best possible compromise between height of fletch and length of fletch. Now, the height of the fletch is what gives you your stability. No, that's a short one. That's like a 2-inch. Now, most fletchings that are commercially available as bulk packs will come ratioed on an 8mm shaft. Now, generally speaking, when you're working out the height of your fletching, most fletchings are worked out on 8mm, and they use a ratio of 2.5 to 1 to the shaft diameter. So one times the shaft diameter, you want a fletch which is 2.5 the height. So if you're shooting an 8mm shaft or a 5/16 shaft, you want something which is 2.5 times the height, which is going to give you a 20mm fletch, and that's what is most commonly available. If you just order 12 fletchings on Amazon or eBay, or even if you're a local retailer, you just order the bog standard, that's where you're going to get 20mm high. Now, that gives you a good compromise in terms of stability. If you go a little bit higher, you can increase the stability, but you'll start to increase the drag, which will take off the speed. Now, if you look at most target archers, they will have something like a 20mm high fletch by as little as 1.5 inches long. That gives you maximum stability for minimum drag. A flight arrow might have something that's only 10mm high and about 20mm long, little tiny fletch, but that maximizes the speed with minimum stability. You don't need a massive amount of stability because you're not shooting for accuracy. Whereas if you were roving, which is a similar sort of thing done over distance, but you are shooting at a target at distance and then moving to that target area and then shooting again from the target to the next target, you need to combine the two. So that's when you get things like, but anyway, yeah. So it can be quite complicated. So the main thing to remember is if you want a fast arrow, you get a short overall length fletch. You don't go for something which is 5 inches long, 6 inches long, 7 inches long. Let's see if I can get it in the bag. Something like these. If you were aiming for a fast arrow, that is not the sort of thing you would go for. You would go for something more like that. I keep putting things down. Hope you can see the difference there. The target arrow, you'd have something like that. Something which is a little bit more versatile, you would have something like that, which is twice the length. Now, the reason I've gone for these longer arrows, longer fletchings, It's because I always shoot traditional. So the speed of the arrow isn't as important, whereas the stability is. Whereas in modern archery, modern target archery, it's the speed you want with the maximum amount of stability with the maximum amount of speed. With a good all-round arrow for traditional archery, you're better off with more stability than speed, because most of the time you're going to be using them for field target archery or for even actual hunting. Now the benefit of something like this, which usually would be a little bit lower but longer, if you happen to shoot through long grass or something like that, it's not going to be deflected as easily as would be a short high fletch. And that's something to take into account as well. Now the only other thing I would have to say about if you're choosing a long fletch, because you're not so bothered about speed but you are so bothered about stability, is what you can do, or what you've got to be aware of, is when you fit these fletches you've got to take a great deal more care to make sure they are straight on the shaft. What I do to overcome that is I put a slight helical twist onto the fletch, which makes them a little bit more forgiving, imparts a little bit of spin to the arrow as well, and makes them a little bit more stable for the length of the fletch. So it can be quite complicated if you want it to be. Another thing as well when you're choosing a fletch is they will come in left or right wing. Now this one is right wing. If you look at it from the back, from the front, the vein itself bends over to the right. I hope you can see that. A left wing would bend the opposite way, and they basically come from the left and right wing of the bird. Now, what you can do with this, for instance, you apply this with a slight helical twist, with a 1 millimeter, maybe a 1.5 millimeter offset, so the front of the arrow is a little bit further, 1.5 to like a millimeter to 1.5 millimeters further to the left than the back, imparts twist and spin to the arrow, which again increases stability. That means you can overcome the detriment of the long fletch by putting a slightly lower fletch, but the spin imparts stability as well. It's all a case of experimentation. We're finding out what works for your style of shooting. For instance, if I was going to be hunting, I would be choosing a slightly lower, maybe a 1:2 ratio fletch rather than the 2.5, which on an 8 millimeter shaft would give me a 16 millimeter high fletch. But I'd go for something that was a little bit longer, like this, maybe 5.5 inches long, offset by a millimeter, and it'd be right wing. So the added stability that I would lose from the height of the fletch, I would gain back through rotation, through spin, from the offset and the right wing, which would actually increase stability, but it would also allow me to shoot through grass and possibly light brush if I was actually hunting. The left wing, so the right wing fletch, will actually give you a clockwise rotation. It'll push the arrow to the clockwise. A left wing, as in bends the other way, will give you an anti-clockwise spin. So that can come into effect. That can be useful if you're a left-hand shooter. You might want to choose left-hand or left-wing fletchings to give the arrow an anti-clockwise spin away from your line of sight. But it can actually help to overcome Archer's paradox. It's one of those subjects that can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to do. Now, the vast majority of you guys are going to buy arrows ready made up. I know that. I'd buy arrows that are ready made up as well whenever I'm just wanting a cheap set of arrows, or a set of arrows to give to a younger shooter or something like that. But these are just things that you might want to bear in mind when you're making your own. Left wing versus right wing, in context of left-handed versus right-handed shooters. Length of shaft versus height of shaft. The longer the shaft, the more speed it's going to rob, and the more careful you've got to be about setting the fletching up correctly. Height of fletch can actually massively increase stability, but massively reduce velocity, and that's what you get with the flu-flu fletching. Now the flu-flu fletchings come, like, for some reason it's got a bit twisted around, where you can buy flu-flu fletched arrows which have got really high fletchings. They're not flu-flu. Flu-flu actually comes from the medieval French of fluffer, which actually means fluffy, and flu-flu arrows are fluffy. They have the helically wound fletch around the shaft, which then buds out and becomes fluffy. They are the sort of things you would use if you're hunting for game birds, sitting birds in trees, or if you are participating in popinjay or poppingo, or the shooting the birds like off the stick, type range shooting, because you don't want them to go, because they massively reduce your velocity, while massively increasing stability, but to the point where they don't go more than 40 or 50 yards. So that's something to bear in mind. So that's what all this is, just a quick primer about some of the things you might want to bear in mind if you're going to be building your own arrows. So, right wing versus left wing. Height of fletch increases stability. Length of fletch decreases speed. You need to find a good compromise between height of fletch and length of fletch. Natural feathers are a lot more forgiving, and they will take a lot more damage. I've actually shot arrows that have had chunks taken out of them, and they still shoot straight and fine. Plastic or rubber vanes don't take damage at all, and they are easily damaged, even to the point where if you are not careful, like feather fletched arrows, you can just bunch them up, throw them in a tube, and they will be fine. Do that with plastic or rubber vaned arrows, and the next time you go to use them, the vanes are flattened, and they won't unflatten, they won't straighten themselves out. If you catch a vane on an arrow rest, especially a wire arrow rest, a feathered vane, a fletch, will tend to just brush it off. A plastic fletch will catch on it and tear, and it can be quite a traumatic experience when that happens, because the arrow just stops dead. I've even seen wooden arrow shafts actually stop on the bow because the arrow rest has caught the shaft of the... but that's another video. So you've just got to bear in mind that fletchings become damaged. Plastic vanes, rubber vanes are very unforgiving in terms of damage to them as well. And once they're damaged, you've got to replace them completely. Feathered fletchings, you can keep going for a little while longer before you have to replace them. However, modern plastic rubber vanes are dead easy to replace. Just rip them off. You can get tools which will specifically just peel them off, and then the new fletching is just stuck on with a bit of double-sided sticky tape. It's as simple as that. You can do it in seconds. You can do it if you damage an arrow in the middle of a competition. You can repair a rubber fletching on an arrow in minutes, no problem at all. So there we go. So there's a few things to bear in mind. I could go on and on and on. It can become really complicated in terms of, anyway, like length versus height and all that stuff. Well, anyway, hope you found that interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we will talk again soon. Cheers, guys.